While an exact number will probably never be known, it's estimated that as many as 6 million Soviet soldiers were captured by the Germans over the course of the Second World War. Most of them never returned home. 865 of them are buried here at the Soviet War Cemetery outside of Amersfoort, here in the Netherlands. In September of 1941, not long after the war began between Germany and the Soviet Union, 101 prisoners of war arrived here on boxcars from Central Asia at the livestock unloading facility in Amersfoort after a 14-day journey by train. Most of these prisoners were members of the Soviet army who came from Uzbekistan. They'd been captured on the Eastern Front not long after the invasion began. These soldiers were dressed in rags, and after a long train journey, they looked desolate, dirty, hungry. They were paraded through the streets to the city concentration camp. Along the way, residents of the town did what they could. They came out carrying water and fruit and bread. They felt terrible about the situation, but they were not permitted to do anything about it because the German soldiers regarded the Soviets as Untermenschen, or subhuman, not even worthy of the smallest of human dignities. Now, during their incarceration at Camp Amersfoort, the Russians, as they were called, regardless of where they came from, they were treated with brutality. Within 6 months, 24 of them had died as a result of starvation, sickness, and abuse. The camp doctor even kept 2 of their skulls on display in his office. Now, those soldiers were brought here as much for propaganda purposes as anything else. They were never intended to be kept long term. So on April 9th, 1942, the surviving 77 Uzbek prisoners were taken into the woods outside the camp and executed. It turned out to be the second largest mass execution in the Netherlands during the entire Second World War. Where that happened, outside the camp, a monument has been erected. And since 2012, the Stichting Sovjet Erveld holds an annual commemoration in their honor. After the war, the remains of those Uzbek prisoners were brought here to Rostov. Thousands of Soviet prisoners of war were held in POW camps at Stalag 6A in Hemmer and Stalag 6K in Stukenbrock, where they were used as slave labor throughout the Ruhr Valley. They worked there under miserable conditions, and by the time the camps were liberated by the Western Allies in the waning days of the war in Europe, many of those men were severely ill or dying. These soldiers were admitted to hospitals in German towns throughout the region. And after their deaths, which were often as a result of tuberculosis, the remains of 691 of those Soviet soldiers were interred in the nearest cemetery outside of Germany so that Allied war victims would not have to be buried in enemy soil. That cemetery was the American cemetery in Margraten, here in the Netherlands. Now, after the war, the governors of Margraten Cemetery wanted that burying place to be exclusively for American war dead. And so the nearly 700 Soviet soldiers who were there were brought here to Amersfoort, where they were buried alongside their 101 Uzbek comrades in arms. So Amersfoort thus began to be a collection point for Soviet war victims who were buried in the Netherlands. 73 additional soldiers, mostly Georgians and Armenians who had been slave labor for the Germans, were also eventually buried here. Now, because of insufficient space at the Rostov Cemetery right next to us, where there are war dead from other nations, this special burying ground was constructed. This cemetery officially opened on the 18th of November of 1948, and it was dedicated by the Minister of War, W.F. Schoking. So as I mentioned, the Soviet cemetery is right next to a larger cemetery that contains not only a lot of civilians, but also war dead from other nations. And I'm walking among those right now, which are very, very near to the Soviet cemetery. These appear to be Dutch soldiers who fought, or maybe even civilians. Koninkrijk der Nederlanden. So this is the Rusthof, as it is known. And there are a number of Allied soldiers who are buried here. So we're going to look around a little bit and check those out. You can always tell when you've entered a Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery because they always have one of these crosses that indicates that cemetery. You'll see those throughout. Though in this particular cemetery, you'll also find members of the Polish forces who are buried here. You'll see names that appear to be Italian as well, a number of those. It's quite interesting to see the mix of nationalities in this particular burying ground. It's not something I've seen elsewhere in Europe so far.